The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Wait, Tylor, I know what that means now.
Yeah, no, you really don't.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast. I, of course, am Tylor, who did a much better job of keeping a secret whether this was going to be a fun chapter than many of the previous fun chapters we've had. And I am joined by Greg, who I think for once got completely blindsided by what we had coming. Greg, what did you think about our one-chapter week that I'm pretty sure we will have every bit as much to say about as our previous couple two-chapter weeks?
Wow. Was this an exciting chapter to read? And of course, in case people did not read the description of the episode visible on their device right now, we are talking about chapter 47, The Truth of a Viewing. And yeah, I will even say, like, I started reading this chapter and I was like, oh, this is not going to be a fun one. And then kind of had an, oh my God, what is happening? And got really interested in it. I still have some questions. I need you to walk me through some things, but it was a great and exciting read. I was thinking we always use our old cliche of the roller coaster kind of ascending the hill. And we don't often have the like single moment when it starts zipping down the hill, but I think we got that here, and
Yep.
I think in my edition, we technically didn't enter the last 200 pages, but we like have 201 pages left. So we're there. I feel like we're just zooming into the conclusion, and it's with the part of our recording cycle where I'm like, hey, Tylor, you're not doing anything. Let's also do another episode this week just so I can read a little faster.
Yeah, getting to the end of this book is now officially something that I am very excited for, right? I think you're exactly right to say, in the same way, I feel like the Red Wedding was earlier in that book than I thought it would be. And I feel like this is the same sort of thing, just a really propulsive moment that changes the dynamic of a lot of characters and really makes you wonder what's coming next. But interestingly, just like the Red Wedding, situated at the end of a book. And so as a result, it's unclear how much of the fallout from this we're going to get. What are your thoughts on kind of where this fits in this book, given that it feels very unrelated to all of the other stuff? And then we can kind of dive into the specifics of the chapter.
Well, I mean, I think Siuan is a rare POV character. I think we have had it before, had her before,
once or
maybe
twice.
once, but not a very common one. So I think that was part of my like, well, this won't be that exciting. But and you're right that it's a separate plot line than where we've been, but it fits into this larger. The Dark Friends are sowing chaos absolutely everywhere, and it was kind of as I got into this chapter, I was like, why would Tar Valon be immune to that? Why would they be the exception to the rest of the continent? And so, I do want to unpack what we think is actually behind this. If it is Dark Friends, it's a little more hidden. If this is the Black Aja, it's a little more hidden. Like we have actors who are clearly manipulating things to the ends that happen in this chapter, but it's not necessarily clear what their motivations are outside of the immediate like we know what they wanted to do was take power, but we don't understand necessarily who it is in a larger scheme. So so that's all really fun and exciting and a good chapter. I did like kind of now we're just I should let you summarize first, but we talk a lot about this old thing that I learned from The Office, but I think a lot of shows do, where they have the character names on cards and they just kind of group some new ones, right? I think we've talked about it with Parks and Rec too. It's like, oh, Jerry and April haven't done a episode together. Let's throw them together and see what happens. And so it felt like by the end of this chapter, they grabbed a bunch of cards that some of which I didn't think were active anymore or still on in the mix, and they grabbed them. My last introductory thought will be to say, again, we have read or we have watched and recorded our second season of the television show. And this really is interesting compared to, I guess, what happened at the end of the first season of the television show. Is that right?
Yeah.
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 Do you know the event, or I know we don't want to spoil things too much across, but a different character has a very similar experience in the television show, and so thinking about, oh well, now is this going to be two of them experience that in the television show, or is this just going to be the separate versions of that?
I would be very hard pressed to say that anything that I would say is analogous to this chapter has happened on the television show. I think we are definitely in for that.
Okay. Okay. Cool. All right. I'm gonna shut up because we're talking around the summary and we should just summarize it. So, Tyler, could you please summarize chapter 47, which 47 is the fake number I use whenever I teach citations. My students have never caught on to this, but it's always page 47 on every example I write out all
Smart.
semester long. So
I like it. Uh, can I summarize it? Maybe. It depends on how short what your definition of a summary is. Siuan Sanche is barely focusing on the documents, and she is kind of randomly checking a few things here and there, as is her normal thing. She thinks on Laris, the mistress of the kitchen, who is not checking the sums now that she has a new title. And she also thinks of a brown Aja who is dropping the ball on monitoring stonemasons, and she thinks that there are hundreds of them being brought into the city, which doesn't make any sense. At this point, her temper snaps, and she thinks that there has been no news since she originally learned that Rand held Kalendor. She reads the news that Sarah, who we read about in a previous chapter, and we know was killed, has been sent away and apparently has run away with a farmer. She also reads about Mazima, who is the prophet of the dragon and has 10,000 followers and apparently knows Rand's name, which is rare at this point. We learned that the tower voted the way that she wanted to kind of put her in charge of controlling Rand and also to keep things secret. At this point, the door of her office crashes open, and Elida, Elvierin, and others enter the room. Siuan responds basically with fury, telling them that they need to leave immediately. However, they immediately kind of fan out, search her desk, and trigger the trap, stopping them from getting any of the papers. And then Elida reveals that the Hall of the Tower has voted to depose her. But we also learn that not all of the sisters were there. Siuan is struggling internally, but keeps up her really strong face, saying that there will be a rebellion and that they clearly didn't have any conviction in what they were doing because they didn't invite the full group of sitters to vote. And at this point, Elida tells her that she is going to be questioned, and we learn that Liana, the keeper's warder, has been killed. We then switch to Min's POV, where we see her returning from shopping to see a fire and no guards at the gate. She hears swords in the distance, but thinks of kind of the frustrations that she's been dealing with since she arrived, and she despairs that she kind of came here for a man. She then sees Gawyn leading a group of young men into the grounds, and he tells her to leave and says that Siuan was deposed. He does not say which side he is on, and she thinks that she can't do anything now, but she wants to do something. We then switch into Siuan's POV again. She is in darkness and bruised all over. She thinks that she has told the other side basically everything except for a few small details, but she relishes the fact that she's held those back. Liana asks if she is awake, and Siuan begins apologizing for everything she's put her through, but Liana asks only if Siuan is okay. She eventually insists that she not be called mother, and Siuan urges Liana to rise and to fight however they possibly can, and she tries to be brave when someone opens the door, but she thinks the sound she makes is actually a whimper. Finally, we switch into Min's perspective, who is being assisted by Laris and thinks that Elmindrada reminds her of herself. The key that Min has been using turns finally, and Min sees two young women, only a few years older than her, and she doesn't see any visions around them. But at this point, Siuan speaks up, and Min realizes that this is Siuan and Liana, and they simply look substantially younger. Why is explained very briefly afterwards when Siuan reveals that she and Liana have been stilled. Liana, they both are given clothing, and Liana seems interested in the knife that is given along with the clothing. But as long as they're not recognized, they think they can possibly sneak out. And Siuan comments on the lack of guards, saying that even like a common criminal would have been guarded more heavily than she. And she kind of comments on the fact that this is only because she was stilled. She then asks whether Laris is going to tell anyone about what happened here. And Laris says that she is loyal to the tower, but agrees to give them an hour before anything else happens, and refers to Min as a lively girl, which I find very funny. The group flees from Laris as much as from anyone else. They do encounter Elida briefly in the hallway, but they are not recognized and are eventually able to make their way out. They see that they hear news that there's been over a day of fighting and that hundreds of soldiers apparently snuck in disguised as masons. Siuan regrets breaking the tower, even as she appreciates that some of the Ajas, in particular the blue, sided with her. And we learn that there are no blue Aja left in the tower. All of them have either fled or been killed. We also learned that Elida had set up a false charge to charge Siuan, that's her name, to charge Siuan with, and it is claimed that she is a dark friend. We also learned that she has claimed that she helped to set Mazrim Taim free, and then at this point, it becomes very clear that Siuan believes that the only way to survive after being stilled is to have a very strong kind of mission or goal, and she thinks that getting back at Elida is her mission. She then thinks that there is no need for them to worry about their ability being sensed, which they think is a special bonus of being stilled. And eventually they find 3 horses, including, wonderfully, Bella, but they also find Gawyn. He seems enraged upon seeing Siuan and asks where Elaine and Egwene are. First she tries to dissemble and then eventually says that they are in Ilion, which we know is a lie. She says that that if he thinks she is a dark friend, she could kill him, and he basically concedes that he doesn't believe that she is actually a dark friend. Min has to talk him down a bit, but eventually he agrees to let them go, and eventually he even agrees to let them get through the guards. He's going to help them get past some of them. They discuss briefly some of the advantages of being no longer able to channel. She says that they can't be detected while they are channeling. She says that they are no longer really detectable because they seem especially young, but it's clear that they don't know whether they are going to age normally, which it's worth noting is another hint that regular Aes Sedai do not age normally. We also learn that the guards all seem to defer to Gawyn, as he is considered the leader of the younglings. And we also learn that Gawyn killed Hamar and Kulin, the people who train the warders. Eventually, the group decides that they're going to take a shit so that they can lose any tail that Gawyn may have given them. And Min says that no one will follow them as long as they can get out of the city. Eventually, Siuan says that she can still change the world, even though she no longer has the power, even if it means simply helping the dragon to change the world. And she realizes that it's not just destroying Elida that she wants, but she wants Elida to know what happens to someone when they claim that she is a dark friend and she isn't. Eventually, they come upon Logain, who says that he simply wants to die in peace. But Siuan offers him a way off the island, and he agrees as soon as she mentions that he could potentially have revenge. Min then has the vision of glory about Logain again, but it seems stronger than it was before. She also notes that she saw Gawyn either kneeling at the feet of Egwene or breaking her neck. And then she also thinks that whatever happened today clearly set in motion one of those 2 possibilities. And Min hopes that this was all worth it as she sets off to find a ship. Wow, that was a lot of words for me to say. Pick something from the first half of the chapter and talk about it for him.
Well, I think I wrote down some questions and listening to you again, you clarified some, but I think I would like to start the conversation by asking you essentially what or whom from this chapter we should have a clear sense on before we move in, like before this chapter starts. So by which I mean, obviously we know Siuan. Obviously we know Min, Logain, Gawyn. Kind of take those together. I would put those in the either A or B tier of characters, that these are characters we're familiar with that have been a part of the story a lot.
Yeah.
Who is maybe on the C tier? Like, should we have remembered Elida before this, or is this kind of nuance? And then also, I've already forgotten the name. The keeper, the
Liana.
the other Liana. Same kind of question. And
Yeah.
who else am I not thinking of that we should know already?
Okay, a few names that should go on this list in the C tier. So Liana is one. We've really only had her mentioned kind of as the keeper. She hasn't really been much of her own character at this point, but the keeper is essentially the second to the Merlin, and usually is raised from her Aja. So she would be kind of like the second in command. Not super notable as a character yet, but notable as having held that station. We should remember Elida from a couple of places. One, in the first book, she was the Aes Sedai with Morgase, who gave the viewing of Rand and tried to kind of get him under her control. And in the second book, we learned that she was the advisor to Morgase, but had been sent away when Morgase's new lover arrived. And also that she once had a vision that it was the royal family of Andor that would help decide the final battle. And that's why she was so interested in Elaine and Morgase, is because of that interest. And then when Elaine was sent away at the beginning of this book, learned that that caused Elida to really doubt Siuan and to start to kind of create some sort of what appears to be a coup now, although we didn't know that's what it was building. The only other name that I would throw in there is Alviarin. And the reason I want to mention her is, one, because the first time we had her mentioned was at the beginning of this book. Elida notices her and basically says, hey, we need to talk about Siuan, and she seems to be one of the first people who was kind of brought into that broader conspiracy. What's notable, though, is that Elviarin is a white, and during this chapter is noted to be the keeper of the Chronicles under Elida once she takes power, which means something weird is going on, because a white being the keeper for Elida, who is a red, feels like an odd combination. Typically, the keeper and the Merlin are of the same Aja. The only other names I think worth noting are Hamar and Kulin. Both of those have gotten shout outs in the previous book when we saw Gawyn and Galad training, and then when Matt fought with the quarterstaff against Gawyn and Galad, it was Hamar and Kulin who were doing the training exercises, and they were kind of considered to be among the best fighters of all the warders, who are widely considered to be among the best fighters in the
world. And now Gawyn killed both
of them. Yes.
Wow.
So that tells us where Gawyn is at in terms of his skill tree, if we're thinking.
So I think that was very helpful. First of all, I can hear. I actually get live feedback from our listeners listening in the future, and they all appreciated that. That was very helpful to them. So I think that also helps clarify when we're thinking about Elida. You know, my big question coming out of this is, what is the motivation here? And I think you're clarifying that while it may not be stated directly, it seems more likely that she is thinking that Siuan overstepped her charge, and it's more of a political thing than it is Elida is 100% of the Black Aja, right? If this was Leandrin, we would be like, okay, it's evil people doing evil things, but it's not. And I think that was, we had a tantalizing tease, I believe, when the girls left, that they weren't sure all the Black Aja were gone. They know a big chunk of them left, but there could have been those actors here. So at least at this point, it seems safe to say it's possible, but the more likely explanation seems to be political in nature.
The one interesting clue, this is a relatively late in the chapter note, but if we're talking about it here, I think it makes sense. We learn that Siuan is charged with releasing Mazrim Taim, which we also learn at the beginning of this book is a plan that the Black Aja had and were ready to execute. So that either makes me think Elida is Black Aja and is pinning something she did on Siuan, or that Elida is being duped by the Black Aja, who Elida needed a reason to arrest Siuan, and the Black Aja had a crime that they knew they could provide evidence of someone having committed. So I don't think that resolves your issue, but at least I think kind of highlights that link that there is something still that I'd be worried about with Elida or someone in her inner camp and the Black Aja.
Well, and so I'll finally answer your question back to the beginning of the chapter and kind of the first piece. So it seemed to me the kind of message of the before they enter piece is just that Siuan is treading water and losing, right? Like that there's so much chaos going on and she's trying to keep so many pieces in motion that things are just kind of falling apart kind of naturally. And then we get this big external threat that arrives. Now, Siuan goes through her notes to find, I believe, what's called like a thin piece of paper kind of curled up, which seemed to be a note from Moraine. Is that the right kind of reading between the lines?
Yes, that's correct. That note we actually saw Siuan receive from Moraine in chapter 1 of this book.
Okay. And so, I mean, I don't have much to say about all the specifics she went through because I do not remember how they tie into everything. But again, it seemed to just be like the good guys are losing, like chaos. I'm not even ready to say the dark friends are winning, but chaos is winning. This whole continent is on fire.
100%. I had two quick notes there. One, we should recognize the name Mazima. He is noted here as being the prophet of the dragon and raising a small army of like 10,000 people. We know Mazima as one of the Shinarans who was riding with Rand and Perrin to try to get the Horn of Valir in the second book. So he is clearly much come up in the past book and a half in terms of his influence in the South. The other quick note that I had here is just, I think you mentioned at the beginning of our discussion that you were kind of surprised by how big of a chapter this turned out to be. I think the reason why is because Robert Jordan does an excellent job of head faking towards this is going to be the like catch up on what's going on in the world chapter. And I just want to say he executed it perfectly. Everyone, I think, is blindsided by what happens when Elida arrives. The big kind of dangling piece, the thing that is not immediately resolved in this chapter, is the idea that Elida did not get the full group of Aes Sedai together to vote against Siuan. She got the bare minimum number of people necessary to get that vote passed. And I think that that really highlights the fact that it's not that the White Tower has turned against Siuan, it's that a portion of it has. And that I think really sets the tone for then later on in the chapter, we learn just how devastating that conflict was. Was there any other details that you found interesting in that kind of early section before we switch into Min's POV?
I did like that detail about getting the bare minimum there. You know, I am not totally well versed on how our United States Congress works, but there are times where like they have to keep the Senate technically in session because they're blocking some bill. So like they all go home, but some guy who's kind of local has to come in and gavel the session in order. And I don't think there are examples in US history where that guy then grabs like 5 buddies to get a quorum. But I've been in faculty meetings that essentially ran that way, where they're like, oh, that's half plus 1, so let's start voting now. And it's usually not a coup attempt or anything like that, but it is kind of funny how that works. So I did like that detail for the reason you said, and also just thinking about then when the fighting erupts, it's like, well, there would be a huge number of people who wouldn't believe all of this had happened even, right? Like that they're getting the secondhand account. And then you know, again, I was about to explain to listeners for the umpteenth time. They're like, I know things from Star Wars, and so that's how I think they certainly
They're aware.
know that by now. But it feels very much like Order 66, where all of a sudden it's like the Jedi are evil, and all the troopers and the galaxy seems to just like go with it, but not because they don't really understand what's happening. So it feels kind of like that kind of moment.
I have never obviously like walked into a like true emergency situation, but I don't know if you've ever had the experience of like you're walking for the two of us, you're like walking through the Boston Common and you're going to go to the movie theater and you see a crowd outside of like the movie theater and you go to walk inside and it turns out there was like a fire alarm pulled and the crowd is everyone who evacuated the theater and you're just walking down the street and then suddenly you're in an emergency situation, right? That is the moment that I think Robert Jordan nails at the beginning of this Min section. The idea that something ground shakingly important could be happening a few blocks from you, and you don't know it unless you happen to turn in the right direction and see the right puff of smoke and hear the right noise at the right time. I thought that was my big takeaway from this first Min section, was like, I think Robert Jordan kind of nailed that feeling of like impromptu. Like we didn't know this was coming. And so I think it's exactly as you're describing, things kind of shift on you when you're not looking, when sort of irregularities.
I will agree with that, but also couple it with the fact that like as a reader at the end of the first Siuan, I was like, oh, there's no hope. Like she's
Right.
alone here. All our other allies are very far away. And then it was like immediately like, oh, there's a little bit of hope. And that's what the chapter ends up proving, is that she had one ally left in that general area.
Yeah.
I'm right. And I guess
so
we gain a couple more by the end, but yeah. So it was fun in that regard, but I do think you're right. And being that feeling you're describing and then being like overwhelmed. It's like I wasn't in this drama, but now my whole day has changed, which, is a feeling that I think a lot of us have experienced on a smaller scale than what is being described here. I would hope not at the scale. Nobody's wandered into a coup, I don't think, but give it another 6 months. We'll see how things turn out in this country. Not that I'm dating this, but yeah, go ahead.
6 months before the coup, we're dating it, in case you're wondering. I don't really have much else from that Min section. I think everything I want to say, I can say better in the second Min section. I really liked Siuan's like mini motivational monologue to Liana, trying to tell her like how they're going to get through and they're not going to give up, and then simultaneously her like on the inside not believing in any of it. That works really, really well for me. I guess I just have to say, like, good speech, Robert Jordan. Anything you had in terms of this section, I feel like it's a wonderful character moment that is there to establish Siuan is no one's damsel in distress, even as she's about to be rescued from it.
Yeah, I will say I felt disoriented at this transition because it felt in some ways like a lot of time had passed, and yet like things had happened, quote unquote, off screen, but
Yeah.
it was actually pretty quick because this whole chapter is like a day, if that, right? Like
Yeah,
it's
I think
not
this is maybe
weeks
like
and
12,
weeks.
18 hours later.
And so there was that, but then I actually think that was a productive emotion to feel because that's how it feel
Yeah.
like that's how Siuan is feeling. So I will err on the side of giving Robert Jordan too much credit rather than too little, in that if the character that is your narrator is feeling disoriented and like their world has entirely changed, you should give that feeling. Like I think
Yeah.
Siuan feels that days have passed and it's only been 12 hours, if that.
Okay, in that case, we need to talk about the elephant in the room. We have talked about Moraine and Varen having ageless faces, and now we see that if you are stilled, you look substantially younger. What is your take on this new piece of information, right? What does this tell you about Aes Sedai aging? Do you care about that even a little bit like I do? What's your thought here?
Let me ask the question back to you to make sure I understand the question. So
Yep.
we have had it previously confirmed that when somebody is an Aes Sedai, they do not age at the pace other people do. And this was shown on the television show kind of directly, right?
Yes.
That a portrait of Moraine from a long time ago looked just like Rosamund Pike today. So spoilers for season 2. Sorry, that doesn't matter. It's not that consequential. But so that is what we knew prior to now, although perhaps not that directly stated in the books thus far. And
Correct.
what we have learned this chapter is that when you lose your Aes Sedai status, and are then able to lie. I noted that, and you emphasized it in your summary. Um, I I see that the person is now like young. So it feels like they perhaps returned to the moment they took the vow or were earned the title in some way, something
To
like that.
I am, I think, here giving information that is possibly in a glossary somewhere, but I don't think we've like actually dug into in the book. But I would be willing to put ages for Siuan and Liana somewhere in like mid 40s. And they probably became Aes Sedai 18 to 19 years. So they have lost, yeah, about the same amount of time that they were Aes Sedai. They appear, Min, I think, is like 20 or 21. She says that they look 6 or 7 years older than her. So yeah, maybe they aged a tiny bit since they became Aes Sedai, but certainly not the like ageless face can't put an age to them that has been described for other Aes Sedai.
Well, and I think what's confusing and why I wanted to ask that question back to you is because I don't know, from other fantasy or just in general, you would think it would go the other way. When you lost your status, you would
Yeah.
be the age you should appear. So if Moraine is secretly 80, she should suddenly be an 80-year-old. That seems to be how the rules would work. I guess in a culture that values youth over age and experience, right?
Right.
It was surprising and confusing because I think in my head when she's like, they look young, I kind of mentally went like, oh, they're old now. But like I could link it to the age thing, but I hadn't like
Yeah.
picked apart the steps we just did.
And I think that where we are at then is like this still feels weird, right? Like we get that stilling is what caused this, but all of the interactions, right? The ability to lie, I'm surprised by. The fact that they get younger instead of older, I'm surprised by. It still feels like there's some sort of mystery here. Robert Jordan isn't just outright saying, like, and this is what happens every time. We know it, right? The characters are like, we've never really observed someone who's been stilled. They usually die very quickly. So I think that this is a thing to keep our eyes on, even if we don't really have too much else to say about it. But I thought it was really fun seeing Siuan kind of play around with that. Like, what can she get away with? She tried to lie. She tried, to use the fact that they're younger as a disguise. There's like a variety of advantages she finds. And I found that kind of fun to see someone who previously we had seen as kind of the person with all of the tools. Now we get to see her figuring out how to work with the one weird, bizarre tool she does have.
I'll just co-sign that that was fun and was exciting. I guess further questions I want to kind of pick apart is that their consciousness clearly does not change. It's not like they erase their
Correct.
experiences or anything. They have their whole knowledge, including a whole lot of really stupid fish references, which are all
Yup.
over this chapter and have not been noted yet. So I will note them here. That's like, we get it. You're from a fishing village. We understand. So, but yeah, I want to keep an eye on that. And especially, I guess to broach the topic of the larger stilling. So again, we had what I was referencing in our opening is on the television show, a character has been stilled. Nobody has been like toppled from the top of
Yeah.
a throne in the way that occurs in this chapter. But because we've seen a stilling, I wondered, oh, will this be then the second character to get, because it wasn't
Yeah.
Siuan in the show. So will it be the second character to be stilled, or will they shift this plot line in some way or something? The show continues. If listeners are frustrated that they haven't watched the show, I'll say the show continues to take all the correct pieces, but just jumble them up in so many ways
Yeah.
that you really can't know what is going to happen. Like just knowing the books is not a reliable way to know what will happen on the show, at least to some degree. So
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. It'll be really interesting, I think, to do a compare and contrast whenever we talk about, season 3 of the television show, being able to think about what's the same and what's different between those, plot lines when presumably we maybe get something that looks like this on the screen. Um, what did you think about I thought there was this really great moment where Elida is directly in front of them, and it feels like all of the characters have very different reactions, right? Like Min almost tries to ignore it, and it's clear that Siuan gets angry, and Liana almost like freezes, like tenses up. I thought that was a really well played moment. Did that stand out to you, or was there anything else? I feel like we got a good like 3.5 pages of, and then we went there, and then we went there, and then we dodged this, and then we went there. Was there anything in that that you really enjoyed or that stood out to you?
Um, Not deeply. I think this is the section I did clock Bella, and because we've teased you before about your love of the horse names, I that was probably the standout in that. But I think in other fantasy books or often in like a video game, you are about to like run off. So there is that moment where you just kind of like, all right, gather just enough food, get a costume to get out of here. Like it's um this is not for podcast time, but the new game overview for Star Wars Outlaws dropped, and it looks like a lot of that type of stuff, like sneaking around, and I was here for it. Uh-oh, now I made you nervous about a video game that's coming out much later.
That's correct.
But I like that kind of gameplay. It's very Assassin's Creed to me, where you like set up the situation where you get your supplies and get all the things, and then you kind of make your play or your move. And so that seemed to be what they were doing. Um, I'll transition. Maybe you want to backtrack once I do so, but I will transition into my notes on Gawyn. To quote directly from my notebook, is he a thing now? And walk me through this. So I actually will change the second part from walk me through this to I will walk you through it, and then you correct what's wrong. So on I recorded a different podcast today about the movie Hitman, which is a lot of fun, which stars Glenn Powell. Glenn Powell showed up to the red carpet of Hitman, and his parents were with him, and they were holding giant cardboard signs. His mom was holding up, I believe, "Stop trying to make Glenn Powell a thing," and his dad was holding up, "It's never gonna happen," which is hilarious because he's been in
Amazing.
2 giant movies this year. He'll be in another one this year before it's out. And I feel like I just want to put Gawyn in the middle of that photo. Like, stop trying to make Gawyn a thing. So as I understand it, stuff started to happen, and Gawyn kind of ran in to start the action. Based on your summary, it's like Gawyn naturally sided with Elida, kind of in loyalty to Morgaze and the throne of Andor, the royal family. That's essentially how he thought he was acting, even if it's not correct in our minds.
I would say it was partially that, and also partially he felt kind of betrayed by Siuan not telling him where his sister and Egwene were. And so I think he both had kind of a natural allegiance to Elida and that disdain for Siuan.
So in the fighting that happens off screen, he proves himself to be quite capable, killing these 2 warders that we already mentioned,
Yeah.
Hammer and Sickle. No, what are their names?
Hamar and Kulin. It's also worth
Okay.
noting that he apparently took control and is now the leader of what are known as the younglings, which are all of the people who were in training to be warders but had not yet become warders, and so they didn't have an Aes Sedai on one side or the other to choose an allegiance.
And so that's what he's done off screen. So when he bumps into the party again, he seems to immediately want to just take out Siuan. Like he figures out the ruse, he sees through it and wants to just kill her, but is convinced by Min
Yeah.
primarily, right,
Mhm.
that they are working in a way that protects Elaine and Egwene,
Yeah.
and so he needs to help them. And I would say characterize that as begrudgingly he helps.
Yeah.
He agrees to kind of do the minimum to let them out, which seems small but also seems giant, right? Like
Right.
he could have joined the party and been like, "I'm coming along. Let's go save the world." So it seems small that he's just like, "I'll give you a note," or it's not even a note, right? He'll just get them past one set of guards, essentially.
Yeah, I think he
Um,
does give them a note that should theoretically get them around some guards, but that's not the most helpful.
So then the fact that he did even that feels like a huge swing for that character's allegiance within this chapter. He just killed a bunch of people in support of the coup to take out
Yeah.
Siuan and then is helping Siuan. So I found that a little confusing, but maybe talking it out has helped me recognize that, like, what does he care if she goes now, because his side is in power. like you just said, in charge of the younglings and will be tied to a high level Aes Sedai, it would seem, when he's ready.
Yeah, I want to take that because I think it's exactly the right place to be in terms of analyzing Gawyn, and then put that together with the vision that Min describes at the end of the chapter. She says she sees both Gawyn breaking Egwene's neck and Gawyn kneeling at Egwene's feet, and it flickers between the two as if she's not sure which one would happen. And she says that something about what Min did on that day helped make the decision between those two outcomes. And I think the moment that that has to be is when Min suggests that they help Siuan to help Egwene and Elaine. And so that starts getting me wondering, is this now Gawyn is going to be guilty about doing this and it's going to cause him to resent Min and Egwene in some way? Or is this going to be the thing that maybe sets him against Elida in some way, gets him turning the corner towards Siuan, and does that eventually lead him towards Egwene? Like, I don't want to give any details away, but I think putting the narrative you're describing plus the revelation of Min's viewing, I think gives us a really interesting kind of thing to think about until the next time these characters.
And I'll just, since we're on that bit, I want to go back and talk about one bit before that, but since we're on that bit, I'll just say really cool conclusion, right? Like, I'm not always the biggest fan of prophecy, but I think in this regard, it's less like proving later. My immediate reaction is if she's having both these visions, it's going to be both, right? Like that both can be true because the character leans so hard into it's either this or that. I think could eventually be both in some way. We have had, I believe, I'm not crossing streams again. We've had hints that Egwene will someday be very powerful within the Aes Sedai hierarchy, right? She's had visions of herself in the chamber, right? At the center of.
Yeah, I think she was dreaming, not having a vision, but yes.
So it seems like potentially all of this. I mean, I'm getting more and more of a feeling like we are in every regard clearing out the old generation, and what we've been doing is following the next generation that will take over everything, right? That Rand will be the dragon, and that we'll have the Queen of Andor, we will have the new Amerlin seat. And so it's feeling more and more that way. Not that I think that will be a easy path or happen in book 5. I have long since dropped my dream that this was like a 18 generation story, and understand that we're moving at too glacial a pace for that to be so.
That is correct.
I think maybe by the end of the 15th book, they will land at those positions if this is at all accurate.
Well, I'm not going to tell you whether it is at all accurate. But what I can tell you is there is an accurate prediction. You're going to get some more Logain, and he may or may not have glory in his future. That was the last kind of detail that I need to put in here is what is your thoughts on Logain joining up? Because we had gotten enough hints to know that he wasn't going to permanently go away. But I don't know if I was anticipating this being the group he would join up with or this being how he would break away from his more or less imprisonment in the White Tower.
Again, it's really interesting because he's done different things in the show. So I was like, where my mind goes is I become a mush of like, wait, which things were the things we read about Logain and which were the ones we saw him? For people not watching the show, the actor who plays Logain is particularly good. So like, you're always excited when Logain shows back up. So I'm excited in that regard. My note in my notebook is something that I think we've actually said before, which I just think about Gollum. In Fellowship of the Ring, when Gandalf said it was mercy that stayed Bilbo's hand, and Gollum's story is not yet done, I think is always one of those really cool Tolkien moments where you're like, that's what his values are deep within this larger story. It's like, we're going to prove that mercy is good. And Logain seems to be that exact same type of figure. In a lesser story, he would have had his throat slit. I'm looking at you, George R.R. Martin. And with just like two beautiful women making out in the background. But sorry, that's Benioff and Weiss, not George R.R. Martin.
George R.
And now we're just casting shade, and maybe our listeners will be insulted by this. Everybody's like House of Dragon season 2, let's do this. And I'm like, nope, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice. Not going to happen. So I have stayed out of that, even though it seems to be making people very happy. And all that's to say that I think I'm excited because Logain is like one of those characters where I don't know what the end of this arc is. He doesn't fit an easy category. He is a little Gollum-y, like I'm saying, but he's not motivated in that way at all. I mean, he's asking here for like a quiet place to go die. And so like, is he going to come out of that funk? I'm currently playing a D&D character that's essentially in that same mood. So it'd be great to see him either overcome that or play some part in this story before succumbing to that peaceful death. But what a chapter, though. I mean, you called it. We did just about our full time normally on this chapter, and it was really a big surprise. And again, we joked about the length of this book meant maybe it was the last 300 pages, but now that's the last 200 pages. I'm like, this has to be all action all the time if we're going to get any sense of resolution to these plot lines. And so next week we jump back to 2 chapters. We're going to be reading chapter 48, An Offer Refused, and 49, Cold Rocks Hold. I only looked at the chapter icons, but I know where we're headed. So I think it's good that we're going back to some plot lines, even though in true good fashion, I don't want to switch, right? I always like that in this structure of a book where you're like, you can't wait to get back to a character, and then you're like, oh, we're leaving so soon. Oh, I guess I'm excited about that too. So it's a good feeling. You win either way, is what I'm trying to say. So Tyler, say some things to close out your thoughts.
First off, I think if you want to talk about nonstop action, an offer refused and other contract-related language is how you amp up the action at the end of a book. Second, I just want to say, especially when we get towards the end of these books, sometimes I think the thing that stymies me the most is my inability to make forecasts and predictions. And so I want to invite all of you to join us in this. If it's your first time reading the books, hop on our social media, tell us what you think is going to happen at the end of this book, 2 books, 3 books from now. We'd love to be able to make fun of you exactly the same way that we make fun of Greg when you say something that sounds ridiculous and is possibly true. And guess what, y'all? 7 weeks left means that we are almost through the glass.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend the show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.